The call came in just after midnight. A neighbor had noticed something unusual: lights flickering in the house across the street, shadows moving erratically behind the curtains. And then, nothing. No more movement, no more light. The house, once so full of life, seemed to have gone completely silent. When the police arrived, they weren't prepared for what waited behind that door. Inside, the air was heavy, suffocating. A sickly metallic scent lingered, one that officers would later describe as unmistakable and unforgettable. The living room looked as if a storm had swept through it. Furniture overturned, shattered glass glinting on the floor, and smeared handprints trailing along the walls. And in the middle of it all, lying motionless on the rug, was an 18-year-old girl. And her body told a story of fear, of struggle, of violence that had escalated far beyond control. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who had once laughed and dreamed and planned for a future that now would never come. Just weeks earlier, she had been celebrating a milestone: graduation, a marker of endless possibilities. Her life was supposed to be just beginning. Instead, it ended here, in this quiet suburban home, under circumstances so brutal they defied comprehension. At first glance, the crime seemed like a random act of violence, the kind of nightmare no one can anticipate. But as investigators began to piece together the fragments of her life, a different picture started to emerge. There was someone else, a man. Older, charismatic, and charming in a way that could disarm even the most cautious of hearts. Their relationship had been the subject of whispers, the kind of thing people talked about but didn't interfere with. What had started as an affair had unraveled into something far more destructive, leaving a trail of shattered trust, escalating tension, and choices that could never be undone. So, how did this happen? How did two lives so vastly different yet tragically intertwined end in a scene so horrifying that even the first responders struggled to put it into words? To understand, we have to go back, to trace the steps that led to this unthinkable moment. Who was she? Who was he? And what happened in the hours leading up to that final, devastating act? This is the story of a love that turned fatal, of decisions that spiraled out of control, and of a crime that left a community searching for answers that may never truly satisfy. Welcome back to Echoes of Crime, where the past speaks and the truth demands to be heard. I'm honored to have you here as we delve into another gripping case. To my returning subscribers, thank you for your unwavering support. It means the world to me. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story. Now, let's dive in and uncover the echoes that refuse to be silenced. To understand how this story began, we need to look back to a time when her world was still filled with possibility and his life appeared unremarkably stable. She was 18 years old, freshly graduated from high school in a small, tight-knit town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Her name was Emma, a young woman with an infectious laugh and a knack for lighting up any room she walked into. She had plans to move to the city, to study graphic design, to carve out a life that was entirely her own. But like so many in that liminal space between adolescence and adulthood, she was still figuring out who she was and where she fit in the world. Then there was him, Mark. He was 34, twice her age, twice her experience, a man whose presence had a way of commanding attention without even trying. He wasn't particularly wealthy, nor was he especially good-looking. What he had, though, was confidence, an easy charm that masked something deeper, something harder to define. In a town like this, where life could feel monotonous and small, someone like Mark stood out. He was the kind of man who knew just what to say to make someone feel special, important, seen. Their paths first crossed at a coffee shop, the kind of place where everyone lingered because there was nowhere else to go. Emma was working part-time there, saving up for college, while Mark was a regular customer. Their first conversations were light, harmless. He'd compliment her smile, ask about her day. She thought nothing of it at first. Just another friendly face in a town full of them. But then, the conversations grew longer. He started waiting until her shift ended so he could walk her to her car. He'd offer to help her with little things, car repairs, errands, things that, in isolation, seemed innocent enough. Slowly, subtly, a bond began to form. Mark was older, wiser, and he had stories to tell about places he'd been, people he'd known, things Emma had never experienced. He made her feel worldly by association, like she was stepping into a life far bigger than the one she'd always known. To Emma, this felt like something exciting, something different. To Mark, it was something else entirely. What started as a friendship quickly turned into something more. Their relationship became a secret, one they both agreed to keep hidden. Emma told her friends she was just busy when they asked why she was suddenly disappearing after work. Mark assured her it was better this way, safer for both of them. After all, people wouldn't understand. And in a way, he was right. When whispers about their relationship inevitably began to circulate, they were met with raised eyebrows and quiet disapproval. What could a grown man possibly want with a teenager? Some would ask. She's just a kid. Others would mutter. But Emma didn't see it that way. To her, Mark wasn't just some man. He was her escape, her adventure, her chance at a life less ordinary. She'd believed him when he told her he cared, that he only wanted the best for her, that he saw in her something no one else had bothered to notice. And maybe he did. Or maybe what he saw was someone young, impressionable, and easy to control. As the months went on, their relationship grew more intense and more isolating. Emma started pulling away from her friends, ignoring the concerned texts and phone calls. Mark encouraged it. "They don't really understand you," he'd say. "Not like I do." The signs were there, of course, if anyone had known where to look. The way Emma's bright personality seemed to dim ever so slightly. The way Mark's affection sometimes shifted into sharp words and icy silences. The way their once playful banter turned into tense arguments over small things, like who she was texting or where she was going. Would you have noticed the red flags? Would you have spoken up? Or would you, like so many others in that small town, have looked the other way, telling yourself it wasn't your place to get involved? For Emma, this relationship felt like a lifeline. For Mark, it was something else entirely. And, as their connection deepened, the cracks beneath the surface grew wider, darker, more dangerous. The kind of cracks that don't just break, they shatter. It wasn't long before the secrecy and intensity of their bond became something far more toxic, far more volatile. And as the walls around Emma's life closed in, the tension between them reached a breaking point, one that would leave a trail of destruction no one in that town would ever forget. Speaking of which, jail was constantly described in the newspapers and the filmmaker's appraisal. It all started with a coffee shop and a smile. It ended with a crime scene and a question. How did no one see it coming? The secret couldn't stay buried forever. Small towns are like that. Nothing ever truly stays hidden. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors turned into confrontations. The first to notice something was wrong was Emma's best friend, Claire. They had been inseparable since middle school, but lately, Emma had been distant. She stopped replying to texts, ignored calls, and always had an excuse for why she couldn't hang out. "Is everything okay?" Claire asked one afternoon, cornering Emma outside the coffee shop. Emma hesitated, her eyes darting to the ground. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked ever so slightly. Claire didn't believe her. Then there was Emma's mother, who couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She started noticing little changes, a bruise on Emma's arm that she brushed off as nothing. The way Emma's once bubbly demeanor had become guarded, almost withdrawn. When she pressed her daughter about what was going on, Emma shut her down. "You wouldn't understand," she snapped, retreating to her room and locking the door. Mark, too, was changing. The easy charm that had first drawn Emma in was fading, replaced by something sharper, more possessive. He'd text her constantly when she wasn't with him, demanding to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. At first, Emma found it flattering. "He just cares about me," she'd tell herself. but soon it became suffocating. The confusion faded. Her eyes turned toward the TV with a frantic impatience. She watched a section of the commercial without interest. One night, after a rare evening out with friends, Emma came home to find Mark waiting for her. His face was calm, but his voice was cold. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone making it clear this wasn't a casual question. Emma stammered out an excuse, but Mark wasn't satisfied. That was the first time he raised his voice, the first time she saw the flash of anger behind his eyes. It wouldn't be the last. The pressure was mounting. People were starting to talk openly about the relationship, and not kindly. Parents warned their daughters to stay away from Mark, calling him creepy and trouble. Friends distanced themselves from Emma, frustrated by her refusal to see what they thought was obvious. The isolation was exactly what Mark wanted. But Emma was beginning to see cracks in the facade. She found a note in her locker one morning, written in shaky handwriting. "You're in danger. Get out before it's too late." At first, she thought it was a cruel prank, but the words stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Who had written it? What did they know? And why wouldn't they tell her directly? If she could talk, she thought, maybe she would find out what was going on. Then there was the time she caught Mark going through her phone, scrolling through her messages with the calm precision of someone looking for evidence. "I was just making sure you weren't keeping secrets from me," he said when she confronted him. His voice was steady, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. Emma started to feel like she was being watched. She'd catch glimpses of Mark's car parked down the street when she was at work, a shadow outside her bedroom window late at night. At first, she told herself she was imagining things, that the stress was getting to her. But the feeling wouldn't go away. And then there were the fights. They started small, a disagreement over plans, a sarcastic comment that landed wrong, but they escalated quickly. Mark had a way of twisting things, making Emma feel like she was always in the wrong. "I'm the only one who cares about you," he'd say. "Everyone else has already given up on you." The turning point came one night when Emma decided she'd had enough. She told Mark she needed space, that things were moving too fast, that she wanted to focus on herself for a while. Mark didn't take it well. "What do you mean, space?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "After everything I've done for you?" Emma tried to explain, but Mark wasn't listening. His face twisted into an expression she didn't recognize, and for the first time, she felt genuinely afraid of him. When she reached the last building, she saw that Mark was waiting outside the self-checkout line. A week later, Emma confided in Claire, finally admitting that she didn't know how to get out of the relationship. "I feel trapped," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He's everywhere. He knows everything. I don't know what to do." Claire promised to help her, but before they could make a plan, Emma disappeared. At first, her mother thought she had gone to a friend's house, that maybe she just needed some space. But as the hours turned into days, the pit in her stomach grew heavier. The last time anyone saw Emma alive was outside the coffee shop, getting into Mark's car. As the search for Emma began, a single piece of evidence surfaced. Her phone, found in a ditch just outside of town. On it, a chilling text message from Mark. "If I can't have you, no one will." It was a message that would later unravel the entire story, but for now, it was just the beginning of the nightmare. The night Emma disappeared was colder than usual for that time of year. A dense fog had rolled in, blanketing the small town in an eerie silence. Mark had convinced Emma to meet him one last time, promising that he only wanted to talk, to make things right. Despite her better judgment and the warnings from Claire, Emma agreed. "It'll just be for a few minutes," she told herself, as though repeating the lie would make it true. They drove to the edge of town, to a secluded clearing near an abandoned cabin that Mark claimed was his thinking spot. It was the kind of place you'd only go with someone you trusted, and Emma, despite her growing fears, still believed there was some good left in him. As they stepped out of the car, the sound of the wind whipping through the trees was the only thing that broke the silence. Emma's unease grew as Mark's demeanor shifted. His charm was gone, replaced by a coldness she hadn't seen before. He accused her of lying, of seeing someone else, of trying to humiliate him. His voice grew louder with each accusation, and Emma, trembling, tried to reason with him. "Mark, I'm not doing this. I just want to go home," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. But Mark wasn't listening. He moved closer, his shadow swallowing hers, until there was nowhere left for her to go. What happened next was quick, brutal, and irreversible. The struggle left marks everywhere, on her skin, in the dirt, and on the surrounding trees. Emma fought with everything she had, but Mark's rage was unstoppable. In those final moments, all the dreams she'd once had, college, a career, a life of her own, were extinguished, leaving only silence in their wake. When it was over, Mark stared down at what he had done. Blood stained his hands, his clothes, the earth beneath him. He hadn't planned this, he told himself. It was her fault. She pushed him too far. That's what he'd say later anyway. For now, he was just a man standing in the aftermath of a horror he couldn't take back. The next morning, Emma's mother called the police. She had spent the night pacing the living room, dialing her daughter's number over and over, only for it to go straight to voicemail. "She wouldn't just leave," she told the dispatcher, her voice breaking. "Something's wrong. I know it." The search began almost immediately. Friends and neighbors joined the effort, combing the woods and fields, calling Emma's name into the unyielding silence. Days passed with no sign of her, until a hiker stumbled upon a shallow grave in the woods. The scene was harrowing. Emma's body was partially covered by loose dirt and leaves, as though whoever had put her there had been in a hurry. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised, and her hands bore the telltale marks of a desperate struggle. The air around the site was thick with the smell of decay, a grim testament to how long she had been there. For the officers who discovered her, it was a moment that would stay with them forever. "I've seen a lot in this job," one of them would later say, "but nothing prepares you for that." Emma's family was shattered by the news. Her mother collapsed when the police knocked on her door, her screams echoing through the neighborhood. Claire, who had been holding on to hope that her best friend would come back, broke down in tears, unable to comprehend the loss. The town, once a place of quiet familiarity, was now a place of mourning, its streets lined with candlelit vigils and posters bearing Emma's face. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Mark. He was the last person seen with Emma, and his behavior in the days following her disappearance raised red flags. He showed up to work looking disheveled, his hands bandaged, offering vague excuses about an accident. When questioned by police, he was cooperative. Too cooperative. He claimed Emma had been emotional when they last spoke, that she had walked away from him in the woods and he hadn't seen her since. But inconsistencies in his story began to emerge. A search of Mark's car revealed traces of Emma's blood, faint but undeniable. His phone records showed a flurry of calls and texts to her in the hours leading up to her death, many of them angry and demanding. And then there was the discovery of the murder weapon. A rock, stained with blood, found not far from the grave. It was a crude, impulsive choice, one that left no room for doubt about what had happened. When he'd taken it out, he languished over the memory of the beating he had received. Still, the case wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Investigators uncovered chilling details about Mark's past, rumors of controlling behavior in previous relationships, restraining orders filed and later dropped. There were whispers of another girl, years ago, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. As under the original claim, this story too had long since been denied. But the most disturbing discovery was a journal found in Mark's home. In it, he had written obsessively about Emma, detailing their relationship in a way that painted her as both his savior and his tormentor. The final entry read, "If she leaves me, there's nothing left. No one will take her from me. No one." As the case unfolded, the town was left grappling with the horror of what had happened. How had it come to this? Could someone have stopped it? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, were there other victims out there, lost to Mark's destructive obsession. The trial that followed would reveal even more shocking twists, but for now, all that remained was the devastating truth. Emma was gone, and the world she left behind would never be the same. Mark's trial became the centerpiece of the town's collective grief and outrage. Every detail, every shred of evidence, was dissected in the courtroom, with reporters crowding the benches and cameras waiting just outside. It wasn't just about Emma's murder anymore. It was about understanding how something so horrifying could have happened, and whether anyone could have stopped it. As prosecutors laid out their case, a clearer picture of the relationship between Mark and Emma began to emerge. What had initially seemed like a whirlwind romance was exposed as something far more disturbing. Mark's controlling nature wasn't a secret to everyone. His coworkers had noticed his frequent outbursts when things didn't go his way, though he was careful to keep his temper in check around Emma in public. Friends of Emma's recalled her mentioning small incidents, like how Mark didn't like her wearing certain clothes or spending time with people he didn't approve of, but she had brushed these off as signs that he just cared a lot. One witness, an ex-girlfriend of Mark's, testified about her own experience with him. She described a man who started out kind and attentive, but who became possessive and manipulative over time. "He made me feel like I couldn't live without him," she said, her voice trembling. "And when I tried to leave, he threatened me." Emma, it seemed, had been caught in the same cycle. During the trial, the jury was presented with Mark's journal, a disturbing account of his obsessive thoughts about Emma. His entries painted a man who was unraveling, consumed by a need to control her every move. He wrote about how she was slipping away, how he couldn't bear the idea of her leaving him, how he would do whatever it took to keep her by his side. Then came the most chilling revelation, a voicemail that Emma had accidentally left on her mother's phone just days before her murder. In it, Emma could be heard arguing with Mark. Her voice, tense but firm, told him, "I can't do this anymore, Mark. I don't feel safe." His response, barely audible but filled with quiet menace, was, "You don't get to walk away from me." It was a damning piece of evidence, one that left no doubt about the trajectory of their relationship. Investigators also uncovered a series of online searches on Mark's computer in the weeks leading up to Emma's death. They ranged from "how to make someone stay in love" to far more alarming phrases about how to dispose of a body. Combined with the physical evidence and the journal entries, it was clear that Mark's actions were not impulsive, but calculated. Mark's defense team, however, attempted to paint a different picture. They argued that he was a man pushed to the edge by rejection and emotional turmoil, that his actions were those of someone who snapped in the heat of the moment. But the jury wasn't convinced. As the trial reached its conclusion, Emma's family took the stand to share the impact of her loss. Her mother spoke through tears about the light Emma had brought into their lives, about the future that had been stolen from her. Claire, her best friend, described the guilt she felt for not doing more to help Emma escape the relationship. The community, too, grappled with its role in the tragedy. How many people had noticed the signs and chosen to look the other way? How many times had someone said, "It's not my place to get involved"? Mark showed little emotion as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even with the case closed, the questions lingered. What drove Mark to such extremes? Was it simply an inability to handle rejection, or something deeper, an ingrained need for control, a belief that Emma was his possession rather than a person? Perhaps the most haunting question of all was one no one wanted to say aloud. Had this been his first victim? Had this been his first victim? In the years since Mark's conviction, new information has surfaced about his past. Police have reopened investigations into the disappearance of another young woman who had briefly been in a relationship with him years earlier. While no charges have been filed, the similarities are unsettling, and they raise the possibility that Emma wasn't his only victim. Could anyone have predicted how far Mark would go? Were there moments when someone could have stepped in, said something, and changed the course of events? And now that justice has been served, Does it bring any real sense of closure to those left behind? These are the questions that linger long after the courtroom has emptied, the headlines have faded, and the town has tried to move on. Emma's story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked control and the importance of listening to those who feel trapped. The truth about what happened may have come to light, but the shadows it cast will remain for years to come. The impact of Emma's murder reverberated far beyond the courtroom. For her family, it was a loss that could never be truly measured. Her mother, once a vibrant and outgoing member of the community, retreated into herself, struggling to find meaning in a world that had taken her daughter away. "Every time I see her picture, it's like I lose her all over again," she said in an interview months after the trial. Emma's father, who had always been more reserved, channeled his grief into action, becoming an advocate for raising awareness about abusive relationships and the warning signs that often go unnoticed. "If one person recognizes the signs and gets out because of Emma's story," he said at a community event, "then maybe her death won't have been in vain." For Claire, the guilt was almost unbearable. She replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, wondering if there was something more she could have said, something that might have convinced Emma to leave sooner. She eventually started a support group for young women, creating a safe space where they could share their experiences and seek help before it was too late. The community itself was shaken to its core. Small towns like theirs are supposed to be safe, quiet, and predictable. The idea that someone like Mark, someone they had worked with, shared meals with, passed on the street, could commit such an act was deeply unsettling. Trust, once taken for granted, became harder to come by. Parents became more vigilant, watching their children more closely, asking more questions about who they were spending time with. Teachers and coaches started paying closer attention to changes in behavior, hoping to catch the signs that had been missed with Emma. The town held candlelight vigils and installed a memorial bench in the park where Emma used to sit with her friends. But even these gestures felt inadequate in the face of such an unimaginable loss. For the investigators who worked on the case, the images of what they had seen stayed with them long after the files were closed. One detective described the emotional toll of the job. "You try to compartmentalize, to keep it professional, but there are some cases that just stay with you." Emma's was one of those. Many of them began advocating for more training on recognizing and addressing domestic abuse, pushing for changes in how these cases are handled at every level. "This wasn't just a crime of passion," one officer said. "It was a slow, deliberate build-up to violence. If we'd caught it earlier, maybe we could have saved her." As time passed, Emma's story became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of how easily the warning signs of abuse can be overlooked or dismissed. Her case was cited in workshops, school programs, and advocacy campaigns, shining a light on the subtle, insidious nature of control and manipulation. The lessons were clear but difficult to implement. How do you intervene in someone else's relationship without overstepping? How do you convince someone they're in danger when they don't believe it themselves? These were the questions that lingered, unanswered, in the wake of Emma's death. But there were also unanswered questions about Mark. While the evidence against him was overwhelming, there were gaps in his past that no one could quite explain. A handful of old acquaintances came forward after the trial, sharing stories about women who had abruptly cut ties with Mark, often under mysterious circumstances. None of these accounts could be definitively linked to Emma's case, but they painted a troubling picture of a man who had spent years hiding in plain sight. Was Emma truly his only victim? Or was her death just the first time his actions had been fully exposed? Investigators have reopened several cold cases, but for now, the answers remain elusive. Emma's story is one of heartbreak and loss, but also one of reflection and awareness. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about relationships, power, and the blind spots we all carry. Could more have been done to protect Emma? Could someone have spoken up sooner? And what about Mark? Was he born with the capacity for violence, or was it something that developed over time, shaped by his own experiences and choices? These questions don't come with easy answers, but they're worth asking, because in the end, Emma's life was more than just the way it ended. It was a reminder of how fragile and precious life truly is, and how important it is to pay attention to the small details that often go unnoticed. What do you think about this tragic tale? Were there moments where things could have turned out differently? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments. And as always, remember, awareness and action can save lives. If you or someone you know is in a situation that feels unsafe, don't hesitate to reach out for help. But the lessons it leaves behind continue to unfold. The question is, are we willing to learn from them? Want to uncover more crime stories like this? Stories that explore the human side of the most haunting crimes? Make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. In the next video, we'll explore the chilling case of a woman who vanished without a trace, only for her secrets to resurface years later in the most unexpected way. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. What are your thoughts on Emma's story? Do you think someone could have stopped Mark before it was too late? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next video.